This is Dave Monk, the Prairie Monk, WEFT Champagne, 90.1 on your FM dial. And I have to switch to the other side. Today I wanted to give a little memorial to Dick Bishop, who was a math professor, passed in December, but he'd been a stalwart in the Sierra Club and kept it together with newsletters and picnics and going to places. I can well remember him organizing people to show and tell their summer activities, often oriented to Sierra Club objectives. And I can remember canoeing around Homer Lake with him when at a Sierra Club outing. We'll miss him. He's a stalwart. Otherwise, I'm wanting to follow through with what we've been doing. We've been looking at some of our natural areas that not everyone knows about, and we have a responsibility to let people know about them, and we need to organize for letting people know how they can work with those natural areas. We talked about a strategic action plan, and we sort of dipped into Monticello as an area that has potential for development. I wanted to continue that today. Monticello is located on a major river, the Sangamon River, where early on people used to come up the river to settle. It's an area that has had a traditional railroad traffic. And from a natural history point of view, it has the Cerro Gordo moraine. So not only does the river come through, but the Monticello itself is located on a moraine, and that gives us some character and some drainage. And sometimes that's a problem because the drainage comes through the city, but it's a city that's located 25 miles from Champaign and about the same distance from Decatur. And it's also near to a number of surrounding communities. So when we look at Monticello, we're looking at the river, the moraine, the railroad lines, and also some industry which was early on. Dr. Colwell invented a pepsin, or learned about pepsin, and created a trade for the use of pepsin for calming alimentary canal disturbances that didn't really have an enzyme like pepsin to work with. The area is to some extent a bedroom community for Decatur and Champaign, and but it's quite independent, has a very nice retained city square, and good schooling, interesting religious bodies. It's close to Allerton Park. It's close to Lodge Park and Shady Rest. These are natural areas that are reasonably undisturbed. And so we're looking at Monticello as a possible place where tourists could come. They already come. They visit the Brown Bag for lunch, or they're visiting a national level railroad museum. So we've discussed this somewhat before, but it has to get more specific. And that's often a problem because there is also a need for an overall concept, and there is a need to think about the elements that could go to make an overall concept, but be individual pieces that could happen independently other than an overall concept. The overall concept might be something for 100 years, but some of the specifics might be something that could happen tomorrow. So let me look at my notes, and I think I've said something about Monticello itself. Let's look at the railroads, because they provide a lot of potential. There were 3 railroads. An active Norfolk-Southern line comes north-south from Chicago area down through to Bement, where it joins the Wabash line. There was an Illinois Central line which came through from Champaign to Monticello to Decatur, but also turned west to Clinton, and then on to Lincoln and further west. The aim was to get across the Illinois River, the Mississippi River, and to join the railroads coming in from the west. The elevators serviced by these beds were close together, and they've been superseded by major elevators. So often the small towns that went with the elevator and the railroad are obsolete. The elevator is not obsolete. The grain goes on the road, and that can be a tax challenge, because the heavy use of roads for grain transport means that the roads are broken down fairly quickly and need repair, and that's a costly business. Railroads tend to have a heavy expenditure to start with, but then the cost of running the rails is not as high as road transport. So what can we do in the Monticello area? So we've got these main lines, the Illinois Central main line closed out, and the 7 miles of that trackage was taken with the rails retained by the Monticello Railroad Museum, which is a national level museum, and it's visited by a lot of people. And there's some local income to that attraction. The 7 miles that was purchased has a Y on each end. A Y is a triangle where you can take a train and move it round, and so that the engine runs front ways again. Or it can allow a train to move west to Shady Rest, Madden Creek, Lodge, DeLand, Weldon, Lane, and Clinton. The lines cross the river. The river has an ambience of its own. There are movements to gather land on the riverbanks to keep the river from eroding and to provide access to people. There are 3 truss bridges that Heartland Pathways owns that go over. 2 of them go over the Sangamon River, and 1 of them goes over the Salt Fork Creek in Clinton. The 7 miles that the Railroad Museum owns has the chance to go west or go east. The eastern connection is being re-railed by the Champaign, Havana, and Western Railroad. It's a historic railroad with the intent of getting into Champaign with historic trains. The other leg goes down to Shady Rest, which is on the Cerro Gordo Moraine, so it has bottomland forest and upland forest and some terrain which gives it character. It is a lot of wildlife, understory plants, and it's a soil and water conservation easement and recognized as a natural area. 1 mile of rail could take the Monticello Railroad Museum down to that site and to a Chautauqua. Or it's a 30-acre area that has been platted for development but never happened. So it's been used as a picnic ground for people who couldn't take a horse more than about 15 miles. It has been retained, and you could rent cabins out there. You could fish in the Sangamon River and enjoy the area. When it was flood time, some of it would be flooded, but the upland was available. A really nice site. We have some questions about whether a train and people could come down the railroad bed. Traditionally, people have walked the railroad beds, and they probably will do, no matter how you try to stop that. And it's also interesting for people to do that. It's not that invasive, but you have to convince the people who drive an engine that it's safe to do. And we figure that can be done with scheduling. It can be done at 2 miles an hour. It's a sort of niche interest to people who have never ridden a train before. The area between Whiteheath and Seymour to the east is in the process of being re-railed, and eventually we hope that will open up the opportunity to bring historic trains into Champaign. The main line itself replaced a parallel interurban. The Railroad Museum went out to Monticello from North Neilshire Street in Champaign when it bought a parallel 7 miles of abandoned interurban trackage. It probably is not 7 miles because the city owns part of it for a bicycle trail. But the interurban allowed this museum to initiate and do interesting things. Then the main line closed out, so now the main line is used for short trips of 3 miles into Monticello, and a Norfolk Southern Railroad depot that was on the active line was moved to the Railroad Museum terminus in Monticello, so that you have a traditional railroad depot there. The trains could go to Whiteheath, that's 7 miles, and that would be exciting for Whiteheath, but the beds are often used for storage of grain and empty cars that are owned by ADM, and those cars provide funds for demurrage, for parking there. So not all of the trackage is available, but the income is there, and so when you're thinking about developing these areas, you have to think about that sort of situation. At the southern end, there's another Y that you can turn a train on, but there's also access to the active Norfolk Southern line, so if you have to bring a historic engine in from Indiana, you can have it arrive at the Railroad Museum on an active line, and that's important because if you're going to bring in rolling stock, it's easier to do it that way than to have to shuffle it onto a semi-trailer and drop it off. So that access is important. At the west end, Heartland Pathways bought 6 miles of abandoned right-of-way, minus the rails and the ties. And the city of Monticello has installed a popular and safe trail called the Sangamon Bridge Trail that runs across the Sangamon River, provides you with access to see what it's like. It's high enough that it avoids flood stage. It has a long approach trestle, which you have to worry about some because there's always a temptation for people to create fires that can actually remove a whole trestle. And we have had one occasion like that. The rail trail is a short one. It's narrow enough that the vegetation, the habitat on either side, comes up to these sides of the trail. So you have that close association. The rail could be extended to Cisco, another 4 miles, and that is being considered. At the moment, that's where we preserve Prairie. If you think of rails, trails, and greenways, we had to do a lot to talk to the grain companies and see if they wanted to take grain over the Sangamon River and down to Bement. We are very aware that although the railroad beds are being abandoned, there are still connections which are very helpful because if you have 2 outlets, like at Decatur and at Bement, you have the opportunity to bargain for the price of your grain, and you can work with different markets. We went through that era. We bought it, though, with the intent that it would be an interim trail and that the rail would be rail banked for future use if it was needed. It's not likely to happen, but the opportunity is there. That the rail trail that the city has installed it joins the old town on the Cerro Gordo Moraine to the more flatland to the west of the river. So it's popular for recreation, but it's also a vital connection between the more recent suburbs and the old town. If you look at the next 4 miles, it represents some of our only prairie. So we're very cautious about having a wide trail. We've watched the Kickapoo Trail go in and managed to take out a lot of the only prairie that we have left. So we are interested in a trail, but we're not interested in a wide trail. And that's difficult because various agencies that provide money for doing this are often oriented to recreation rather than to preservation, and that means that the funding comes with purse strings or apron strings that demand that the trail be wide and creosote free, and by the time you've worked on that, you've not got any prairie left. So at the moment, the next 4 miles remains in prairie. It goes past a little settlement that was put there by Sam Allerton in the Civil War, where he was providing food for the Union Army, and he made enough money to be able to buy Allerton Park. The little village is called Armenia, and it's been disconvolvulated some, so it doesn't have some of the character that we would hope it would be there. But that's part of what happens if we sit around and cogitate and don't move and shake the idea. You can't move and shake the idea too fast. We're hoping that the ambiance of the city 2 miles will encourage further thoughts for extension of the trail to Armenia and further to Cisco, where the rail has been retained for 15 or 20 miles into Decatur as a grain line. The 4 miles is paralleled by a road. It was very traditional to parallel the road and parallel the rail, so it went in first, and that was the highway that moved between Champaign and Decatur. It's as a road reasonably wide, and it has been superseded by an Interstate 72, which more or less parallels the old highway into Decatur, but is perhaps a half mile away. That takes most of the load of traffic off an old highway, which is now reverted to the county, and we look upon that as a possible shared bicycle way all the way into Decatur. Most of the surrounding towns have bikeway plans and bikeway implementations, but connecting them together is a difficulty. So that's looking at the sort of Decatur end of Allerton Park and what we can do. The park has assigned a mile by 66 feet of cornfield that supports the park to encourage the habitat and wildlife in the abandoned railroad bed. Now that's probably about 10 years old and is a restoration prairie. Rattlesnakes were found there, and that encouraged the attempt to encourage the eastern Massasauga rattlesnakes that occupy Allerton Park in other places, but also one dead rattlesnake was found on the Heartland Pathways corridor, and that inspired the planting of vegetation to provide a spirited place for rattlesnakes. Eastern rattlesnakes are not outrageously anxious to cause problems. You can almost sit on them and they don't object. But they're not like some of the western rattlesnakes that are more aggressive. But we have that potential there. And we have the potential for shared bikeway and the potential for an actual trail through the prairie, which, if treated carefully, could become an educational device for teaching people about their heritage, which they don't really always know. So, in order to do some of these things, we need leaders who do know and understand the nature of the resources. Now, if you go to the north end of the Railroad Museum, the bed that runs into Champaign is contiguous, and that is a whole other situation. But it also has an interurban which is owned independently, but which we would like to have as a trail that would parallel the railroad bed. This dreaming, it's wishful thinking, but that could be augmenting the railroad bed that Heartland Pathways bought for prairie preservation. It has some disadvantages because it's got an easement for power lines on it, and there's always a temptation for power lines to remove the trees underneath the power lines because they're short and cause fires. And but it's gone from removing the vegetation with axes and saws to herbiciding, and not even blankets. So it's not even spot herbiciding, it's blanket herbiciding. So we've lost some of the prairie that's there. The potential for re-railing is there. The re-railing has already been commenced. We need ties, 2,000 ties a mile, and we don't have a lot of trees to do that, so we have to think about alternatives, which could be it could be steel ties on bends. That is actually being used. It could be ceramic ties, ceramics or plastics that are made from the like of ash that comes out of coal burning fires. So we don't know quite well we get the ties, but gradually we hope to come to Seymour with rail, and from Seymour to Bonneville and into Staley and Champaign, the rail is still intact. So railroad engineers are working with the Surface Transportation Board in Washington that controls railroad abandonments, and at the moment that rail bed is in hold. It may cost us about $1 million to buy the rail intact, because the rails are worth money and the ties are worth money. So, but we are trying to move and shake the replacement of trackage between Whiteheath and Seymour, so that we can verify that we would like to use that 3 miles of active line that is already abandoned. Go back to Whiteheath, and the rail bed runs down to Shady Rest, and that's a short mile, but if you extend over the Shady Rest Truss Bridge to Madden Creek and a bottomland tributary, you can go up to Lodge and across the Norfolk Southern active line and along to Deland, Weldon Lane, and Weldon Springs. It will probably be a long while before we get the support to make that a trail and an area that is also a preservation site. That's what we're anticipating at this time. That has to have a lot of understanding by adjacent farmers, and they have been very understanding. In some cases, there's been some difficulties, but that's the name of the game. At the very western end, 5 miles of this railroad bed would join Clinton Power Plant Lake with Weldon Springs State Park, and that would be a very attractive opportunity, because it goes down and across over a truss bridge over the Salt Creek near to Clinton Lake, and then goes up a hill to across a Hensley moraine in this case, which gives the area character. The Weldon Springs has an artesian spring which generates water and creates a lake and runs regularly from underground aquifers. And so we have to think about how we might be able to sell or lease a part of our railroad bed to Weldon Springs. It hasn't necessarily been an era with lots of money for this sort of thing, but over the years, private people and groups have managed to save some of these places, and in this general area, those 2 state parks are very well used. They're probably about 25 miles from Monticello itself, but they're an extension of that corridor. If you go a little to the north, there's a railroad line that runs from Champaign to Bloomington. It's owned by Norfolk Southern. It's very active between Champaign and Mansfield, because that is where grain comes out of the Anderson or Cargill elevator that's in northern Champaign. It's a supermarket elevator. It takes over from X number of small wooden elevators that were used in a different era, and those railroad lines have closed, but the railroad lines that are servicing super elevators are usually very well maintained. They're heavy duty, and part of the railroad industry lately has been to maintain main lines. That means they are especially interested in dual trackage, because there's a battle between very expensive freight trains and subsidized people movers or Amtrak. So there's a disconnection between the two industries, and often people in Champaign who are going to Chicago and vice versa have to sit in a passenger train that waits while a multi-million-dollar 200-car train moves past. Even just to stop the train and start it again is going to cost a lot of fuel. So the railroads are working hard to improve their trackages from Los Angeles to Chicago to New York, and they're being fairly successful at that. One line that runs from Virginia to Chicago has upgraded its tunnels so that they can double dump intermodal trains. They've taken trackage that goes around hills and put them through hills. They've improved the speed rating of the track, so that they've cut off something like 2 hours off the travel between Virginia and Chicago. So we appreciate the railroads and what they're doing, but in the background we can work with the abandoned railroads for many different purposes. When you go from Whiteheath, from the Y of the Railroad Museum, down to Shady Rest and across Madden Creek to Lodge, that's one thing, but you have an active line there that goes north and south. So with a little imagination, you could take that train down on that active line to Monticello and back to the Railroad Museum on a circuit of 23 miles. May not ever happen. It's not easy for amateur railroads to occupy professional lines. It's costly. You have to have a pilot. But there have been discussions about closing out that line. So if you have something in your file cabinet that says what we might have in mind, then it might be possible to either have a trail that goes down that line that is already active, or if you got super interested, you could possibly have a restaurant train that would go from Nelson's Crossing, which is the depot for the Railroad Museum, up and over the Cerro Gordo Moraine and down to Shady Rest, across Madden Creek and up, and then turn around onto the main line that comes down to Monticello and back to Nelson's Crossing, and that would involve 33 miles of circuit, and probably about 10 or 15 mile of active line that, if it was abandoned, could be retained as active line and used by the Railroad Museum. This is not simple stuff. It's costly to do this, so you have to think in terms of multi-million dollars. So it's not going to happen quickly, but the potential is there, and we should have in our minds what might be possible, and what might be possible without big-time development science. This is mild-mannered tourism, and the opportunity is there to do things that are rather interesting and exciting. And it needs the understanding of the people who are involved, and there are always lots of different opinions. So there's a need for leaders who know enough about the territory that they can introduce neophytes to the territory, and there's a need for the general population to know the value of the elevator or the Pepsin factory or a city square or artifacts or features that are interesting that can be interpreted. And you have a Bryant cottage at Bement, and actually the interurban goes down to Bement, so there could be an extension there. So we're looking at a region that has tremendous potential. And how do we go about doing that? And how do we inspire people, teachers, leaders, to think about how this area might be visited by populations from Decatur and Champaign and other places. Bicyclists especially are riding across the country, and they want to stop off at places. They're not necessarily hurrying across the country. Sometimes they can be, but there's also the type of bicycle person that's going to take 6 weeks to ride across the country and visit small towns and find out what your town has to offer, and this is part of fun tourism. Those people are going to come and use a restaurant or gas up at a location, and there's economic value to this. And how do we put it together in a document that might be 50 pages long for planners, but also a 30-page for people who are especially interested, and a 3-page for slightly interested people, and then a 1-page flyer for people who may not be interested until they're interested, sparked by a flyer. We need people that are interested to the extent that they will volunteer to do things like remove invasive trees and gradually get to have camaraderie that looks at the overall dimension, and but also looks at the little pieces, like the 4 miles between Monticello and Cisco, that could be utilized. We've lost an elevator there to fire. We've lost a lot of the Armenia facilities, so it behooves us to think fairly soon rather than to leave this sit, because people get very upset by real estate that sits because it could be used. Actually, railroad bed sitting with its prairie on it is a form of land use. Not everyone understands that, because they think that extra 100 feet could be used for corn and soybeans, and so it's in its natural state. It's not being utilized. We have to inform people that this is a situation where you're down to 0.01% of the prairie being saved, and this state was 2/3 prairie, and that gene pool is disappearing at a rapid rate. We just lost a 30-mile railroad bed in the Arcola area, and that took out a lot of remnant prairie. We were lucky we were getting a bridge from that area that will go in at Seymour. It's sitting on a semi-trailer at the moment at Whiteheath, and if we get the right facilities, the bridge that is on the semi-trailer will go in over the Camp Creek, and the semi-trailer will be turned upside down over a smaller creek and become a bridge. So people who are interested are gathering up resources that make this sort of thing possible. You have to think about teaching at Parkland College and at the university that will allow interpretive people, artists and media people to get involved and explain what a prairie is and what railroading is. Many people don't understand the details of a stick of rail. A stick is 33 feet long. It has a cross-section that is various depending on what railroad thought was the best way of allowing a steel wheel to roll on it. The cross-section comes with different names, but you can't go from one cross-section to another cross-section easily. So people who are interested in, for instance, the rerouting between Whiteheath and Seymour need to know the mechanisms of putting stick rail together. These days, the main lines don't have stick rail anymore. They have welded those sticks together into welded rail, and when you demolish a railroad bed, as between Urbana and Danville, that railroad is winded up like with a wringer onto a flatbed train that takes that rail to a facility where the junction holes are removed and that rail is welded, and that can come back to a railroad that is wanting to be active. So it may be that we will get some of that rolled rail, but I think we're left with the stick rail and working with it. So you get that from old elevators that have covered up their railroad, and if it's not rusted out, it's suitable for carrying a steam engine. Steam engines are heavy. You have to make the underlying bed substantial enough that when the power wheels, which are pretty heavy duty and tall, hit on the end of, if one stick rail goes down with the weight of the wheel, it hits the next one, which is still up. That means that you have broken rails at the junction. So you have to be sure enough that your bed is stable and that it's well drained, and That's unfortunate in a way, because once you drain it, the trees that like to have well-drained territory come in. But you have to know that you have to have enough room for the rail car to go through. That can be 10 feet in some places, but mostly it's 25 feet. You have to work with the herbicide people and get them to spot herbicide rather than blanket herbicide. These days you can have a helicopter that has a chainsaw on the end of it, so the line can be mechanically maintained without necessarily having to have expensive ground crews. So you watch these technologies. You have to deal with surveying. If you the railroad beds, the railroad right-of-ways, the steel was the monument for surveyors, and there was when railroads were being abandoned, there was a big argument between surveyors and railroaders as to whether the monuments should remain at certain places so surveyors can know where the starting point is. The surveyors lost out. The railroad beds have been removed. That means that you have to go back to a culvert and figure out that this culvert is so wide and the trackage would have been there, and you have to create your own monument. That's very expensive. We have 1 quarter-mile unit that has been invaded where there's various forms of railroading. Mm-hmm. If you're rough and tough and you're friendly and associations don't count so much, you can say that tree, that post, that barbed wire fence or whatever to keep the cattle out is the line. And by handshake you agree that that's it. So that's the first form of surveying. The next form is to have a rough idea of where the fence line is, and that's often set by the fence lines that were there originally. The next form is very detailed because it's felt that you may be wanting to go before a judge to establish a cease and desist order, and if that's the case, the survey involves putting down rebar 3 feet deep so that the monuments cannot be pulled up by mistake, and that's very expensive. So a quarter mile of that sort of survey can cost you $12,000. And that's mainly to ensure that you do own what you're talking about. Got 4 minutes. So I want to say that this Monticello area is not the only area that has real potential. We own 9 acres of restoration prairie, which has a remnant prairie on it at north of Rantoul. And that corridor runs right up to Paxton, a matter of 10 miles. And we would, it's extra wide. It has a main line, retired interurban, a retired Route 45, and then a plot of land that was going to be a dual highway, but Interstate 57 went in. The land had been bought, and that makes that corridor especially wide. and with a little pizzazz, that could be the old concrete road could be a bicycle way and a hikeway. It's like Monticello. It has Highway 45 that has been replaced by 57, so most of the traffic is on 57, and you have what used to be a fairly wide highway that will allow you to put in kiosks or runoffs or have people who are interested to have an opportunity. We lost a high school there that we thought could be a visitor center, but that's a whole nother place where a little bit of regional planning might make it possible to do interesting things in the future. We're thinking that in the interim, developing small junks that can be put together in the future, of taking interested tourists off of the expressway at Kankakee and having them look east and west to sand dunes, and then that were the result of glaciations that dried up, and then come south, look at railroad right-of-way prairies and cemetery prairies at Loader and Prospect and other places, and utilize that 10 miles. That would involve putting in a bridge across an outwash plain creek. So we're looking at other areas, and one of the interesting areas is the Kickapoo Trail. We would like to see that the trail is not so wide that the next 15 miles of development would be narrow enough to retain the native habitat. I think we're near to the end. This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board. As always, the views and opinions expressed are solely those of the speakers and no one else. We didn't mention this at the top of the show. In case you haven't been keeping track, today is Sunday, February the 2nd, 2020.